Greetings and welcome to another Warhammer 40,000 kill team video, where today I'm going over the problem with melee teams. But before we get into things, please remember to like and subscribe as well as comment. Let me know what you thought of today's video. Do you agree, disagree? Any other comments? And remember, I've got a Discord you can check down in the episode description below, and a Link Element Games, and a Patreon if you want to give me some more support as well. But yeah, let's get on with it. So today I wanted to talk about a topic that has been on my mind for a long time, and it's the problem we have with melee kill teams in Kill Team. So today I'll be going over in depth the repeated trend of problems with melee teams we've had, and try and hope this doesn't keep repeating. But yeah, let's get into it. So originally with melee teams, they were never too much of a problem. The only time they were a huge problem at the start of the game was with Custodes, because Custodes from the compendium were very broken, and it fixed itself once they got reined in, because they used to be able to do a free action before activating, so they could move and then charge and then double fight and then shoot. So they were a big problem because you couldn't hide from them, right? But once they were reined in, the only other melee teams we had for a long time were effectively just gene stealers, like Tyranids, which weren't actually too much of a problem. They were really good in the compendium era, but once we started seeing more teams that were 10 or more operatives, they actually started falling back a bit, and once we like expanded missions and stuff. And even Legionary, while being a really good kill team, weren't actually that big of a problem, especially as they were more of a flex team than a dedicated melee team. But it's something we've seen since effectively the launch of dedicated melee teams, with kill teams such as the Galapox Infected, as well as, notably Chaos Cult and Felgor Ravager. So I hope to establish what actually makes them a big problem, because I think a big misconception people have is like it's the boards we play. They do play a role, but it is more of a problem that basically melee kill teams have all just been broken since release. So the first issue are boards. It's terrain, right? Terrain is a problem, and it's kind of a problem because of the reaction to shooting teams, because we had a lot of powerful shooting teams at the start of Kill Team. So notably we had Pathfinders, Vet Guard, even Intercession to an extent, and it hasn't really changed. So we've gotten shooting teams which have gone down in power, but the things about shooting teams is they're actually, even though they were quite strong, they were able to be balanced, except for Pathfinders, with terrain. So we've seen more terrain with heavy terrain in the middle, and also blocking more obscurity. So making it harder to shoot across the board, especially into other drop zones. So you actually don't get many long range shots, which is good. The only downside to that is that actually has helped melee teams a lot, because now it's a lot easier for them to stage up the board. But even then, I don't think that's too much of a problem, because a lot of people forget, even if you have super conceal, as long as you can get within 2 inches of someone, you can still shoot them, right? So hiding really far forward up the board doesn't actually help a lot. But the big problem we have with terrain is either lots of heavy walls with no windows or gaps, or we're playing Into the Dark. So I'll get into the Dark in a minute, but the biggest problem we have is we play a lot of Octarius, and Octarius is a really good terrain set, but the main problem with Octarius is the big L-shaped walls don't have any gaps or windows. So the good thing which I really liked about Vertigus is that it had windows, so even if you were moving up to stage, you could, but on the flip side, basically if someone moved up to the terrain and touched it and then were next to a window, they had a good eye line of basically seeing a lot of operatives if you were trying to hide a whole team behind there, whereas you can't really do the same with Octarius because it's just a solid wall blocking line of sight and visibility. So I think if we played with some more terrain using windows and cracks, notably like Dakota from Luster's Workshop, his terrain does that. So there's a lot more gaps and windows, so you can actually move in and shoot. It's actually what helps with Chow Nath a lot. But then the other problem is Into the Dark. Into the Dark was a huge boost to melee teams because it eliminated shooting turning point 1. Even on open boards, you can actually get a shot turning point 1 as long as you're fast enough, or, your opponent misdeploys. Into the Dark, you can't do that. So melee teams were automatically safe on Into the Dark. And with the popularity of Into the Dark, it suddenly spiked melee teams. Now, we don't really have statistics to buff out, but it did align heavily, where you see a lot of melee teams and even short range teams not doing so well on open, but with the rise and dominance of Into the Dark only or Into the Dark events with it open, suddenly flipped it all around, because the big thing is you just can't shoot them until they engage, which, as we saw, benefited teams like Blooded a lot, but also made other melee teams a huge problem, which is ironic at the moment, because people who dislike Beta Decima because it favors shooting teams. Don't really bring up how Into the Dark does the same, in my opinion, to a worse extent for melee teams. But that's the terrain aspect, and I think the problem with why people think terrain is the issue, I don't really think it's the issue for terrain on open, because it's more the mechanics of the team. But when it does come to terrain, I think it's more heavily the fact that it's Into the Dark that warps melee teams so much. Next, it comes on to the number of operatives for melee kill teams. So in all the melee kill teams we've seen, the big problem is they have too many operatives. So Galapox Infective have 15 operatives, 4 of which are bugs, right? You can't do much. But even Chaos Cult, 15 operatives, and Felgor technically have 20 because they're a kill team of 10 operatives, but you have to kill everyone twice. But you see the main common problem, they have way more than 10 activations / 10 operatives, which is just a lot to deal with. Because one of the main problems Gene Stealers had going into other teams was if you had more activations than them, the problem is they need to be ahead on kills. So they need to be able to charge and kill someone. So they go ahead on trades. The moment you kill a Gene Stealer before they charge and activate and kill you, that's a huge downside to the melee team, because even a team like Gene Stealers going in to fight someone, they're generally taking at least 2 to 3 wounds in return, and that brings them down, because the problem is the moment you kill another Gene Stealer, if you win activations, you can then move up and shoot the other Gene Stealer. And the problem is, like, when there were more teams with like more than 10 activations and 10 operatives, they actually fell back a bit. So you could argue they needed, melee teams needed more models. The only issue is Galapox and Chaos Cult and Felgor have too many operatives in the bad way. Galapox is kind of fine where they are now after like a year of being nerfed, whereas Chaos Cult, 15 operatives is too much, and Felgor, obviously Frenzy is a problem. This has gone out before the latest balanced data slate, so that might have changed by the time this goes out, but Frenzy is just way too good of a mechanic because it forces you to kill each Felgor Ravager twice instead of once, which is a huge problem. And this already highlights the problem we have at activation advantage. But when you have so many models that you can just aimlessly throw away and activate people, it kind of completely negates the downside melee teams have of going for one trades, especially as a lot of these teams now also have ways to do double fight actions during their activations. So all of a sudden, a single model on a 40 mil base, or even 32, can charge 2 operatives and kill them both, and then suddenly go ahead way more on the body activation advantage. And especially with the simplification of missions, it's made having more bodies a problem. But that's a common trend we've seen with melee teams: too many operatives or too difficult to kill easily, which is weird, especially for Felgor Ravager. They shouldn't frenzy from dying in combat. Dying from shooting makes sense, but having to kill them twice in melee is crazy, especially as when they die, they stop the fight action. So it doesn't so you can't keep hitting them to kill them again. You have to fight again, which normally most teams cannot, which is so rough. Then the other problem we have with melee teams is the extra mobility they have. If you look at Galapox Infected, Chaos Cult, and Felgor Ravager, one thing they all actually have in common when it comes to mobility is they all get ways to do multiple / free dashes. So Galapox Infected have Drawn to the Hum, where they can spend a CP. It costs an extra CP every time they use it, but effectively they pick an objective and then they dash, so they end closer to it. But because of how maths work, you can also dash around it, using it as a catapult, where you end slightly closer. Even though you didn't move for it, you dashed around it. So you can get extra mobility there. Chaos Cult, for their Covert Guise equipment, gives them a free dash. And then obviously Felgor Ravager gives them free dashes every strategic phase as long as their leader's alive. But they pick an operative and everyone within white can do a free dash. So all of a sudden, these melee teams have way extra mobility. And especially with Galapox and Felgor Ravager, they can do it every strategic phase, which means normally when you're playing a melee against a melee team, you try and keep out of their range. You try and stay exactly 9 inches away, so you're out from an 8-inch charge with a 1-inch reach. With this, you can't really kite them. You can't really stay out of range. And you can argue, well, melee teams definitely need it. But it's this stacking effect I want to show. They have so much mobility, they don't need it. And then if you look at Chaos Cult and Felgor Ravager, they also have abilities to give them +1 movement. So Chaos Cult can take a mutation to give them +1 movement, whereas Felgor Ravager can spend a CP, so suddenly someone gets an extra inch of movement. So then this entire problem where you're trying to stay out of their range becomes almost impossible, because you have this weird situation where you need to be on the objectives, but because they can reposition so well and spend CP or use abilities to get extra movement, you now just kind of have to go, well, I can't really get out of your charge range, especially with Chaos Cult, who can also stack abilities to ignore traversing, so they can just effectively fly across the board. And once again, it's just that extra mobility. Is like, as I said, melee teams do need a way to get in. For example, Gene Stealers, they can do a free move for a CP in the strategic phase as long as they have a Conceal order. But that is very limiting, because it doesn't benefit you too much if you go second. And also you need to have a Conceal order. So you need to have someone with a Conceal order every turning point, which is also very limiting compared to effectively the free dash for multiple operatives for both Felgor Ravage and Galapox, as well as the extra inch of movement for Chaos Cult and Felgor Ravager, and even you've got the barge from Galapox, which allows them to fly across. But once again, highlighting all these extra mobility tools. Like, if they had one of these things, it would be fine. But the common thing is all these teams have not just one, but 2 to 3 multiple sources of extra mobility, which makes it almost impossible to stay out of their charge range, which is really hard to play against. Now, another common problem we have with melee teams is actually getting access to Super Conceal. So Super Conceal is basically what we in the community have coined for conceal that basically can never be ignored unless you're within 2 inches or ignore the terrain. So while Super Conceal is a necessary rule due to the power creep we had with Conceal flipping abilities, it's kind of been given out too much. And once again, mainly to melee teams, who technically would need it if they didn't have all these other things. So this is actually something Chaos Cult don't get, but Galapox Infected do on their glitch lanes, which they do have 4 of, and then Felgor Ravager can do it on their Psyker, who can also do it in a 3-inch bubble from around themselves. So the problem is, Super Conceal is necessary, but not to the extent that melee teams have it. So once again, Felgor Ravager can do actually with a huge bubble, and when you combine it with the dash reposition, while it does take an action to set up and it goes away at the end of the turning point, you can move up with your Psyker, make this huge 6-inch, well, more larger than 6-inch bubble of Super Conceal, and then redeploy it again in the strategic phase next turning point. So it basically weakens trying to shoot into them on a team that you have to kill twice. And then for the Galapox Infected, while the glitchlings do need Super Conceal, it becomes even harder to deal with a team that you need to shoot, that, remember, if you get close to them, you're also -1 attack dice on your shooting attacks, which has been reduced. It used to be a 6-inch range, but it's come down a lot, but it's still quite a common problem. And it's just this really weird umming and ahhing thing. Like, teams do need Super Conceal to an extent, but not to the ability, not to the volume that melee teams have. Once again, I'm repeating myself, but if they only had one of these things, it would be fine. But the fact that they have at least 2 to 3 of the things I've already mentioned, it's just too much to deal with. Another problem melee teams have is easy Tac Ops to score, easy Faction Tac Ops. Now, usually they have good archetypal Tac Ops, for example, Seek and Destroy, which is so easy to score, or oddly Recon, which is also easy to score. But I'm talking about Faction Tac Ops, like Galapox Infected have, Tech Infect, but also where their Hulks kill stuff, which is really easy. Chaos Cult, I mean, all their Tac Ops are really easy to score. And then Felgor have their Faction Tac Op 3, which is just an auto score. And the problem is, this is kind of a general problem because Faction Tac Op balance is horrible. But notably with melee teams, it's just so easy to score. It means it's not even like you can do anything to stop. So you have this weird thing, and it also contributes how they want to play. They want to be in your face, and all these Tac Ops benefit off of that, which means now they pick 1 auto score Faction Tac Op, and then 2 usually Seek and Destroy Tac Ops that are just easy to score as well. But even if they're going into elites, they have stuff like Security or Recon or Infiltration to fall back onto. Like, once again, Galapox can flip to Security, whereas Chaos Cult can flip to Infiltration, which is really good for them into elites because they have 15 operatives. And then Felgor Ravager can do Recon because they have to be killed twice. They can almost auto-score guarantee like certain Tac Ops because you don't have the ability to kill them out too much. And it's really weird. Like, once again, Faction Tac Ops are a problem in general. But when you look at melee teams, they always just have one Faction Tac Op. They auto score. But when you look at other teams, more like shooting teams or mixed range teams, they actually have a hard range of Faction Tac Ops that are okay or take a lot of effort to score. So once again, it's just highlighting the common problems these teams have. So summarizing it all, what are the common problems melee teams have in Kill Team? It's the fact that partly it's the terrain we play on. Like, you know, people are like, oh, Beta Decima is great because it balances out melee teams, which it does to an extent, and I think that's a good, fair comment. The main problem is actually when we play into the dark, because it just eliminates all first turn shooting or risks of moving up, you know, unsafely, which makes it easier for melee teams to stage. And also the fact, like, not that we play with the current maps that have more, are worse for shooting teams, but it's the fact that we play with lots of boards that have heavy big walls that have no windows or cracks, so they completely block visibility, so you can't get shots. Then we've got kill team size. For example, Chaos Cult and Galapox are all 15 operatives, and then Felgor Ravager are 10, but they all have Frenzy, which means they all have to be killed twice, which effectively makes them 20 operatives, which, you know, something you can't really manage because a lot of these are set kill teams, but you can just minus some operatives. Then it's access to extra mobility, which is either via like movement, extra scouting phase movement, extra strategic phase movement, as well as the ability to get extra movement and or like ignoring penalties for traversing. So the problem is, like, usually kill teams for melee ones have access to multiple ones in this category, which makes it really hard to stay out of their melee range, which they kind of need to get in, but when they have so many sources, it's really hard to deal with. Then it's Super Conceal as well, usually Super Conceal in a bubble. So in a team that you're already trying to outshoot, because that's the only way you could deal with them, you have this weird scenario where they can protect a lot, like at least a third of their team from being shot at throughout the whole game, which becomes way too hard to deal with until you're in your face. And then really effectively auto score Faction Tac Ops with really easy Tac Op selections. Because you have this weird dichotomy where you're now fighting over the primaries, but they're going to auto score their Tac Ops, so then they can just basically dedicate more to the primaries. And you have this scenario, because we're all playing on 6 objectives, you can't actually stay out of a melee team's range without just conceding the points, which becomes a huge problem in general. But what I'm showing is highlighting the common trends we've had with all these melee teams, because every melee team we've had, its main source is melee, has always been broken ever since we've had Galapox Infected. Because we had Galapox Infected, broken, took a year to get into the right scenario, and even then you could argue maybe they're still a bit too good now. Chaos Cult, you know, nearly a year and they're still dominating. They probably need to, well, they definitely need to lose 1 to 2 operatives, devotees, because they're still way too good at the moment. Felgor Ravager, we're praying for an imminent nerf because how they're dominating the meta at the moment. So I'm interested to see what happens when we go forward. And you may say, John, it's only 3 teams. And you're like, I'll be like, yes, but these 3 teams have wrecked the meta. Like, each of these 3 teams at one point, or are still currently at the top of the meta. And even if you look at Chaos Cult, even while nerfed, they're still dominating. And Felgor Ravager were doing the same. They were nerfed, but we're still dominating them. They got buffed, right? We're in a bizarre world. And it's just more to highlight the weird trend we have in melee teams. I'm hoping when we get future kill teams, they don't follow this route. And I could be completely wrong. But it's just so weird they all have this fixed trend. Because obviously, there's the fear of shooting teams. Because you don't want to be shot off the board. But then I think when Games Workshop are designing teams, especially melee teams, they forget, at least with shooting teams, when you're being shot at, you usually have ways to like protect yourself from being shot, like medic and stuffs. Whereas the melee teams we have at the moment, they're so oppressive. You basically have a turning point 1 is you have to do as much damage as you can, which encourages really unhealthy alpha strike play. And then if you don't, you kind of just go, well, I've lost, because they just rush you down and wipe you off the points, because your only hope is to basically go 2-4-2-4 and then kill them as much as you can go 4-2-4 to yourself. And it just encourages really negative play, because I know being shot off the board is really unfun, but when you're wiped off the board by melee pieces that you have no way to interact with until they get into your face, I would say that's more toxic. And as we can see, It's just really weird how melee teams share effectively every common trait I've highlighted. Like I wouldn't, if it was just one or two, I would go like, oh, maybe it's nothing. But they all show the same trend. They either have tons of bodies, they have extra mobility tools, like way more than needed, super conceal, and then easy faction tac ops. I didn't even touch upon the ability to fight twice, because I think that's fair for melee teams to have the ability to fight twice, whereas shooting teams have the on-off ability to shoot twice, because you can argue Overwatch is a way to shoot twice. Now, as someone who is a fan of melee teams, because, you know, I love melee, the issue is kill team melee is already very brutal. It's really damaging, and as you could see with Gene Stealers, it's actually quite hard to balance, because even if you look at Gene Stealers, they have extra mobility and super conceal. But the problem is because they're 10 operatives, they struggle in this scenario where if they don't go ahead in kills, they can actually lose the game, which makes them a lot harder to play, which makes them very honest as a melee team and probably the gold standard how melee teams should be set. So it's just weird how Games Workshop mastered melee teams, in my opinion, with Gene Stealers, like the Tyrannid kill team, and then ever since then have been escalating it higher and higher. Because otherwise, I think the wrong way the community reacting is designing boards where there's no terrain in the middle. So I've seen a lot of kill team boards where most of the heavy terrain is just in the drop zones, and then you have nothing in the midboard. So it just turns into the Wild West of, okay, who has the most durable / most operatives? Okay, let's see who wins this game. Because that is the wrong way to react. Because as a community, we were able to balance shooting teams with terrain layouts, and every terrain layout I've seen is effectively pretty good now, you know, in a good spot for as the community balancing shooting teams, because they're actually quite easy to balance ourselves. But when it comes to melee teams, the point I'm trying to raise is they're so fundamentally broken that it comes down to Games Workshop balancing them better and designing them better. Because if as a community we try and make boards that are better against melee teams, all of a sudden we just turn into kill team shootout, and it would just be one extreme to the other. Because if you remember, before we had Gallop Infected and the rise of these other melee teams, everyone was in a really good spot. Pathfinders were nerfed back, and the game was in a really healthy spot. We had a lot of more mid-range teams flexing between melee and shooting. It was a lot better, and it's just disappointing to see every time you go to a melee team, I'm like, okay, they're either going to be broken or rubbish, but so far 3 out of 3 times they've been broken. You know, we got Mandrakes coming up. Are they going to be broken based on past records? Probably. If we get more melee teams in the future and it follows this trend, they're probably going to be broken as well. I'm hoping I'm wrong. I would love to be wrong. Like, even the Night Lords could be broken, but I hope not. I would really like just balanced melee teams, because we've got balanced shooting teams. Like, look at Halfkin Salvager. Even Exaction Squad, both mainly shooting teams, which are very balanced and fair to play against. So Games Workshop can do it. I just hope we buck the trend when it comes to melee teams going forward, because Kill Team Salvation set a really good level for balance, and I hope it just continues. But that's pretty much it from me today. Just another video talking about, a bit ranting about melee teams, but also trying to explain the problems. So hopefully it makes sense, right? But as always, please remember to like and subscribe as well as comment. Let me know what you thought of today's video. Did you agree or disagree? Are there any points I missed? Anything you'd like to raise? And remember, I've got a Discord you can check out in the episode description below for free, and a affiliate account with games, and a Patreon if you want to give me some more support. So I'll quickly shout out my patrons. So for my Adepts of the Crit, I have Tom, Supercow, Sam, Nick, Kenzie, John Thomas, Graham, Dave Meets World, Dad of Goldens, Ben, and for my Veterans of the Crit, I have Samja. So thank you so much for all your support. It really means a lot to me and helps support the channel. Yeah, so hopefully that came across fairly, because as I said, I do like melee teams. I'm just kind of disappointed they always end up to be broken, and then we have to wait a year for them to eventually get nerfed back into line, right? You know, it would be nice if we didn't have to wait a year for melee teams to get fixed. They just launched fine. But it should be a fun week. I've got some more content. I'm feeling better. Like, I sound better, but I still feel horrible. And I have some more Kill Team content coming out this week. We might have a balanced data slate coming this week. I don't think so, because it's the week of Adepticon. I mean, we should, but it'll probably be delayed to next week. We'll see. We've got some fun reveals. Kill Team reveals coming soon. I can't wait to see what they are. But remember, until next time, no matter what happens when you're facing a melee team, remember there's always a chance to win, as long as you can roll a crit.